Our scripture this morning comes from the Gospel according to Luke in the 13th chapter. Then Jesus told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. So he said to the gardener, "See here, for 3 years I have come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. Why should it be wasting the soil?" He replied, "Sir, let it alone for 1 more year, until I dig around it and put fertilizer on it. If it bears fruit next year, well and good. But if not, you can cut it down." May God add a blessing to these words.
Some years ago at a former church, I ran smack into the parable of the fig tree. Churches, quirky they are, have this ability to run us into scripture passage, perhaps like none other. The landscaping committee at the church had a charter with a series of bylaws, and in Roman numeral 5, row number E, there was a stipulation that if there was a large tree on the church campus that needed to be removed, it would require a majority vote of the landscaping committee. Clearly, this had been a problem in the church's past. And do you know there was a beautiful oak tree that was perhaps on its last leg, and there was some debate as to whether or not it should stay or go, and I kid you not, the vote for people was 2-2. They thought about perhaps consulting an arborist, but that was too expensive. And so on the committee, there was a 5th member who was vacationing up in Maine, and they said she'll have to make the decision. So she gets back in town a few weeks later, having Googled the dilemma, and she shared back with the committee that Google told her that God would want to give it 1 more year. An extended grace period. God gives it 1 more year. Extends grace. Jesus told that parable, the parable of an owner of a vineyard who had a decision to make about a tree. The owner of the vineyard, we're told, visited the tree 3 times, year after year after year, 3 years in a row, and said, "Cut it down." But the gardener in the vineyard intercedes and says, "Let me take out some fertilizer, dig around it, and give it 1 more year." Extended grace for something to move from stuck and fruitless to fruitful and new life. Now, truth be told, if God is this God of an extended grace period, this is a very challenging God for me to wrap my mind around and imagine. For when it comes to our day, when we look out at situations that are fruitless and perhaps barren, our initial instinct is that which is impatient and very expeditiously takes care of the problem. Fire him, fire her, close it down, get rid of him, get rid of her, vote her off the island, vote him off the stage. Take whatever it is and just go forward and then ask for forgiveness later. That is so often our mentality toward that which isn't bearing fruit. And yet the God that we hear about in this parable seems to be a God who extends grace towards something that has been rather lifeless for 3 years. And so we perhaps, in being challenged by the parable, have to consider what God will do as it relates to the situations in our own lives that are not bearing fruit. Those lifeless parts of our lives that are just stuck and we've decided they have no future. A situation that hasn't borne fruit for many, many years, it's stuck, just cut it down. A relationship that just has not been bearing fruit, or a series of relationships, I just don't know what future this has, cut it down. Or a thought about something that we've just decided this is the way it's going to be, and it hasn't really borne any fruit and nothing's really progressing in it. Well, we might as well just cut it down. And it's in the midst of those situations in our lives that are rather fruitless, lifeless, stuck, that we perhaps hear the scandal of this parable, which is not just that God is present for us amidst challenges when we get stuck, but rather that God's grace is present for us amidst challenges that have been stuck in our lives for many, many years, not bearing fruit. For the owner of the vineyard visits the tree year after year after year, and then decides to give it one extra year to see if it might bear fruit. In fact, scholars are quick to point out that the very next text in Luke's gospel might demonstrate the parable of the fig tree to be true. There is a woman who has carried around for 18 years concerns that begin to cripple her back, and it's then that Jesus goes to work. For if the parable is interpreted how many of us would interpret it, that God is the owner of the vineyard, that Jesus is the gardener, and that the tree represents either the nation of Israel or individuals, you and I, then really the image of Jesus that we're presented with in this text is scandalously good in terms of how grace-filled it is. The picture of Jesus that I see here, quite frankly, is Jesus with his gardening gloves on, walking out the door of Home Depot with a great big bag of fertilizer over his shoulder, saying, let's get to work on it. On an area of your life that hasn't borne fruit for year after year after year, partner with me and let's see what happens. In other words, the extended grace period isn't some inactive timeout. It's Jesus very intentionally running towards something that is barren and saying, let's you and I see what we can do about bringing fruit to this situation. In preparation for this message, I read something very interesting in a preaching magazine, that when it comes to the two most classic Give It Another Year stories that you and I have fallen in love with over the past 150 years, there is a gardener figure in both of the stories during the year of grace. The two stories, Albert Einstein and Michael Jordan. You'll recall many years ago, Albert Einstein applied for college at the Swiss Institute of Technology and failed his entrance exam. His friend Marcel Grossman pulled alongside him and for 1 year focused his study and worked toward Einstein passing the exam. And after that 1 year period, you might say the rest was history. But it took a gardener. The same could be true of that other classic 1 year story that we love, Give It Another Year. The story of Michael Jordan, cut from his high school basketball team, the varsity team, when he was a sophomore, and placed by Pop Herring, his coach, on the JV squad. And do you know, for that sophomore year, Pop Herring pulled alongside Michael Jordan and worked with him on his ball handling and on his shooting, didn't even promote him to varsity at the end of the JV season, but went to work alongside him. The next year, Michael Jordan, his junior year, made varsity, and the rest, you might say, is history. The picture of Jesus that we get in this text about the extended grace period is much like one of those two gardeners going to work in that year, saying, even though something has been stuck, lifeless, fruitless, not going anywhere in your life, if that's been happening for quite some time, let's see what we can do to bear fruit. It's a very active picture of grace. I'll close with a final nugget of wisdom about the parable of the fig tree that I sense really depicts the grace of God. Peter Ray Jones, in a wonderful book on the parables, says about the parable of the fig tree, when you think about it, we're left hanging. And we really are. For we don't know what happens to this tree after a year. Does it get cut down? Does it sustain? And there is nothing that we're told about it. And Luke just continues on to the next story in Scripture. And Peter Ray Jones says, if this is the case, then what if the parable isn't the parable of the fig tree? What if it ought to be renamed the parable of the extra year? What if the parable isn't about what we can do in the face of what is stuck, but about rather what the character of God is like in the face of whatever it is in our lives that is stuck or fruitless or barren? The character of God here, a God who keeps showing up year after year after year, plus one more year, even after 18 years, to go to work on something that is not bearing fruit. It's an image of God that is almost too good to be true and rather amazing. But you know, it wouldn't be grace if it wasn't amazing.